Thank you. Thank you. It's not often that the person who introduces your speech is also the person who edited it. Although Danielle did comment, I prepared these remarks in point form, and just as Danielle had this insight that she could imitate Elizabeth Dole by wandering around with the microphone, she pointed out that if I were simply to read these remarks as written, that I could give a perfect example of a speech by Bob Dole. Half sentences, fragments, trailing thoughts, with the punchline tucked 2 paragraphs beyond the introductory material. We're here to discuss the relationship of virtue and freedom. Virtue is a marvelous subject. It is something we all know ourselves to be absolutely stuffed with, but something we are all too sadly aware that our neighbors are deficient in. And because of this splendid quality of the subject, it does tend to arouse certain suspicions in those neighbors when we begin to speak about it. And I'm sorry to say that the neighbors are often right to be suspicious. Nothing so needs reforming as other people's habits, said Mark Twain. And as Twain proved, that there is a vast literature on the subject of morality and how the people who champion it so often turn out to be hypocrites. And it's, I suppose we can take some pride in saying that this literature of moral hypocrisy turns out to be something of an American specialty. That for some reason, perhaps it's the native eye for the easy advantage, American writers have produced a series of magnificent portraits of people who champion morality and then turn out to be utter frauds. What is more American, after all, than Elmer Gantry? I remember working on the Wall Street Journal editorial page, and we got one day in our slush pile, our unsolicited pile of manuscripts, a manuscript by Spiro Agnew. And all our eyes lit up. It turned out that there had been, I now forget what it was, but some conspicuous incident of a jury letting off lawbreakers. Maybe it was the Menendez brothers, I forget. But anyway, Spiro Agnew was enraged by this and was moved to type out on his own word processor a little essay. Of course, all eyes were pasted to the hairline, all eyebrows were pasted to the hairline of Spiro Agnew championing morality and the need to sternly deal with people who broke the law. We sort of looked at each other and said, what are we going to do with this? But being journalists, we realized, well, there's only one thing to do. As mortifying as it's going to be to Agnew, we have to print it. and of course, the mail came rolling in, and Agnew never learned that the joke was on him. But the relationship, virtue and its relationship to freedom is about to become, as engrossing a subject as it always is, it is going to become, after the election in November, an especially pertinent, indeed even explosive issue. I don't think it's generally understood how much bitterness and resentment the various wings of the Republican Party have come to feel toward each other as a result of this horrifically mismanaged presidential campaign. There is, for example, immense bitterness among social conservatives who say, correctly, that for 16 years now they have been the foot soldiers of the Republican Revolution. They have licked the envelopes and they have knocked on the doors, they've done the precinct work, they've delivered the votes, they've actually done the voting. They are the people who account for probably the largest single constituency within the Republican Party. And in return, what do they get? They get the back of the hand. Indeed, even in this past contest, that it was the organized support of religious conservatives that saved the day for Bob Dole when he very nearly perished in the run-up to the South Carolina primary. It was, to a great extent, social conservatives and religious conservatives who picked up Bob Dole and bodily carried him over that finish line that made sure that he would go into the Super Tuesday primary races as the acknowledged front runner, which he was in danger of not doing. And from him, too, they've received very little. They did receive the platform, it's true, but then the next day Bob Dole went out of his way to say how little attention he was going to pay to the platform. Indeed, he had not even read it. And if the Republican Party does as badly in the presidential contest as it looks as if it's now going to do, there will be plenty of voices heard urging that next time the Republican Party jettison moral issues altogether. People like Christy Todd Whitman, Governor William Weld of Massachusetts, Jack Kemp, the big donors to the Republican Party on the Business Roundtable will be saying, forget all this nonsense. It doesn't matter to us, it doesn't matter to the people who pay this party's bills. What we care about is the alternative minimum tax. Get to work on that. Those of us who work in study and pay attention to these issues are constantly astonished. It's much worse than you can possibly imagine how much grinding pressure there perpetually is on the Republican Party to be a party of plutocracy, plain and simple. You see it every time you wander into the halls of Congress, where there's always some group of well-fed looking men wearing very lavish looking lapel pins with little elephants on them. Those are the people who pay the party's bills year in and year out, and it is the alternative minimum tax and not Mapplethorpe that engages their emotions. At the same time, there is a great deal of discontent among the economic conservatives who feel that Bob Dole's defense of the 15% tax cut has been singularly ham-handed. I may be idiosyncratic in this view, but I don't think you move a voter by explaining to him how much cash personally a tax cut is going to put in his pocket. I think voters are public-spirited people, and when you say to them that this tax cut is worth $1,605 to you personally, or whatever it is supposed to be worth to the average American head of household, you insult them. You make them think that this candidate thinks of me as a completely self-seeking individual instead of as a responsible citizen. I certainly do want to hear about that $1,605, don't misunderstand me, but what I would also like to be assured is that the Republic as a whole will benefit from this. And these people also feel injured and offended. They also feel, too, that even the modicum of respect and deference that has been given to social conservatives is too much. It's very easy to imagine a nightmare scenario next time out that would result in almost a de facto split of the party. What if, for example, the Republicans were to nominate Jack Kemp in the year 2000? And if, in reaction, James Dobson, the broadcaster who runs Focus on the Family, were to run as the third candidate? Now, James Dobson, of course, is not a well-known name here in Washington. He probably couldn't get a reservation at a fashionable restaurant. But he is, as it happens, one of the most important and influential evangelists in America. And he has been quoted in a lot of newspapers saying that he does not intend to run for president in the year 2000, one of the infallible warning signs. Or more likely, what if both Dobson and Forbes run on the Republican ballot in the year 2000? That's also a very possible eventuality. Dividing conservatives of both varieties from each other and enabling another dreary character in the Bob Dole mold to swim up the middle. This is bigger than a political question. It is, in fact, a question that touches not just elections, but all of American social life. Because so much of American life is distorted by this false dichotomy between morality and freedom. I blame the law schools for this. Now, of course, I blame the law schools for just about everything, having been to one. But this time is not mere irritability that leads me to this conclusion. It was Edmund Burke who pointed out 200 years ago that in no country in the world, perhaps, is law so general a study as it is in America. This study renders men acute, inquisitive, dexterous, prompt in attack, ready in defense, full of resources, but also, he went on to say, unduly suspicious. They augur misgovernment at a distance and snuff the approach of tyranny in every tainted breeze. Well, I think Americans have, over the past 20 years, absorbed an understanding of freedom that is quite different from the understanding of freedom that prevailed in this country for the first 150 years of the Republic, but that is very similar to the understanding of freedom that prevails in contemporary law schools. As I was preparing this talk, I was moved to pick up one of my old law textbooks, my constitutional law textbook. Now, I should quickly say that the textbook that my class used was not one of these newfangled ones produced by some radical left-wing professor. It's the Gerald Gunther casebook, which is about as respectable an establishment a casebook as there can be on this subject. When you open it up, it begins, naturally, of course, with the good news, the welcome news, that the Supreme Court is the ultimate authority in American life. And you have a bunch of cases on how the Supreme Court is absolutely in charge of America, and don't let anybody forget it. Then we move quickly on to the Commerce Clause and the federal government's total power over national economic life, and then skipping lightly over such things as the enumeration of powers, it is on directly for the final 1,200 of the book's 1,600 pages to the Bill of Rights. Not all the rights in the Bill of Rights, of course, just a few of them. The emphasis is on, of course, the rights that are most likely to lead to antisocial behavior and the reason they need to be defended. So so there are huge, huge sections on the right to be free of race and sex discrimination, the right to die, the right to obscene speech, the right to burn the flag, right to obstruct Lafayette Park in order to draw attention to the plight of the homeless, right to be a conscientious objector in time of war. We think, you see, this way of thinking is, I think, almost now second nature to most Americans. They think about liberty the way contemporary lawyers do, which is as little islands of rights within a general sea of governmental power, unlimited governmental power. When the question comes up, what can the federal government do about advertising, for example, we do not, as Americans would once have done, say, where does the federal government get the power to regulate advertising from? We assume it has it and then say, is there some exception to its general power to regulate that is carved out for the advertising industry by the First Amendment? Some people say yes, some people say no. But unless you are able to crawl aboard one of these little islands of freedom, the general rule is that you are subject to authority. Now, let me declare my stand here. In a crunch, I belong to the liberty-promoting wing of the Republican Party. If I have to choose, if it ever seriously became necessary to choose between social conservatism and economic conservatism, I would belong with the latter. But I don't think, so long as we understand liberty correctly, that we need to make that choice. And I think it is very important, both for the right governance of the country and also for the political future of conservatism and of the party which happens to incarnate, at least for the moment, the conservative cause, to understand that this is so. And to understand, in particular, that the Republicans who boast loudest of their adherence to the ideal of liberty, Republicans like Governors Whitman and Weld and Representative Kemp, Secretary Kemp, in fact, are not championing liberty. The examples of this we have to deliver in shorthand. But Governor Whitman, for example, represents herself as a fearless tax and budget cutter. And she did indeed cut taxes, but she paid for that tax cut through a series of rather gross manipulations of her state employees' pension fund of a kind that Nelson Rockefeller used to specialize in. There has been actually no reduction in the cost of government in New Jersey. Government, in fact, in New Jersey spends more than ever, but because she changed the terms by which the state contributes to her employees' pension fund, that she's able, for the time being, to show a surplus. I think, by the way, this indicates that she is going to be strongly interested in the future in national politics, because she's not going to want to stick around New Jersey when those bills come in. In the same way, William Weld describes himself as a filthy supply-sider and a committed capitalist. But it's also true that he has set up his own state bank to invest in enterprises that he thinks the markets are missing. Now, how in the middle of the hottest market for new public offerings since at least 1961 and maybe ever, you can imagine that there is some worthy enterprise anywhere in the state of Massachusetts that can't get capital? I don't know, but he believes it, or he says he believes it, and has set up a bank that delivers money, that allocates capital better than the markets can, in his opinion, which is, of course, a total defiance of one of the most fundamental principles of a free economy. As for Jack Kemp, well, I have a little section on him, but let's just say the less said about Jack Kemp, I think, the better this week. This misunderstanding of liberty is sundering the conservative cause and making unnatural enemies of people who, whatever their other disagreements about how to live their own lives and what they like and value and what they want to do on Sunday, in the public realm at least, ought to be allies. Americans, I think, are perhaps inchoately coming to understand this. There is, as Danielle said, a renewed interest in moral issues in American life. I think there was an intense understanding of the absurdity of those who, like the ACLU, for example, denounce the proposal to have children wear school uniforms as an attack on a fundamental freedom. Or who, as the ACLU has also done, insist that principals who want to bring drug-sniffing dogs in to check the lockers of students in high crime and drug-plagued high schools ought to get a search warrant first. It is still true that, despite the prosperity of this year, that more Americans say the country is on the wrong track than say it is on the right track. And I am told by people who make it their business to explore these things that when you probe as to what it is that people are worried about, that the longer you talk to people, the fewer answers you get based on economics, and the more answers you get based on a sense that the country is morally deteriorating. Now, perhaps this is something to do with the natural process of aging, that as the baby boom moves on, this is becoming a middle-aged country. Instead of a nation of Dennis the Menaces, America is becoming a nation of Mr. Wilsons. I do have this vision of time to come of Peter, Paul, and Mary serenading an audience of gray heads and long beards on some hillside on the slopes of a river in upstate New York as the protesters smoke marijuana and demand, of course, that young people continue to pay a 50% payroll tax in order to fund unlimited Social Security benefits with their peace signs. Jay Leno has a wonderful joke about Bob Dole. He says that Bob Dole reminds him of the sort of old man who sits on the porch of his house waving his stick at the passing cars. If this is true, maybe Bob Dole's lack of political success can be explained that he's simply defying Tom Wolfe's rule that you should not be even 10 minutes ahead of your times. That there is going to be an audience for this sort of thing. It's just not quite yet. But let me give a homely example that perhaps most directly illustrates what it is that I'm concerned about. The whole nation knows the story of that 6-year-old boy in North Carolina who was suspended from class for kissing a little girl. And I think we've all also heard about the teenage girl in New York who faced harsh discipline from her school for sharing a Midol tablet with a girl in discomfort, with a classmate of hers in discomfort. And these bizarre stories, and others like them that we've begun to hear, have been the talk of the nation. I don't think people have quite come to grips with what these stories mean. The first reaction, the reaction you most often hear on talk radio and where people discuss this at first, is that America's principles have just completely taken leave of their senses, that there's been a death of common sense, that people have just jettisoned good sense, and surely there's some commonsensical solution to this problem. But I think there's something deeper at work. The ancient theorist of Republican government believed that only virtuous people could be free. Human nature, they said, demanded restraint, and either we restrain ourselves or someone else will have to do the job for us. They believed that human societies inevitably followed a cycle. Born in despotism, a society learned self-denial and other virtues. These strengths in time enabled them to overthrow the tyranny and establish a republic. In the free conditions of the republic, people prospered, and they promptly spent their new wealth on fripperies, luxuries, and baubles. Mostly imported, these same theorists went on to say. Tacitus was especially down on foreign imports, which he claimed were draining Roman wealth toward China. China, some things never change. Enervated, the people lost their manly courage, their willingness to defend themselves, and inevitably found themselves subject to despotism again. Okay, well, this is all very antique, but in a petty way, the strange incidents in America's schools cause us to wonder whether there might not be something more to this antique wisdom than we might at first suppose. American students, it is true, when they enter schools, do encounter more ridiculously rigid rules, more overzealous administrators, less common sense, and more petty interferences with their freedom than they did 35 years ago. And I have to say, if I were a high school student, I too would resent it if a drug-sniffing dog came patrolling up and down in front of my locker, and if the principal were checking my socks to see what color socks I was wearing. That would be my parents' jobs, and since my parents were light sleepers, I was able to wear whatever socks I wanted. And indeed, there does seem to be an intensifying national demand for petty interferences with young people. One of the things that's been proposed in this past election campaign is a national drug test for young drivers, which is not only a violation of principles about federalism, but does involve, I think, real issues of interference with people's lives. Why should every 16-year-old in the country be presumed to be a drug addict? But why is this happening? It's also true at the same time that American students generally do behave much, much worse than they did 35 years ago. You can measure it. You can measure assaults on teachers. You can measure declining SAT performance. You can measure the incidences of drug use among teenagers, drugs caught at schools. And the schools have responded to that rising level of mayhem, yes, perhaps stupidly and foolishly and draconianly, but not non-understandably, by imposing ever more draconian rules and applying them ever more strictly and uniformly and with fewer and fewer exceptions. So yes, it's idiotic to apply the term sexual harassment to the misconduct of 6-year-old boys. But it's also true that little boys are dramatically more violent than they were 2 generations ago, and that much of that violence has taken on strangely and prematurely sexual tinge. Yes, it's crazy that teachers would criminalize anti-cramps medicine. But it's also true that there are all sorts of little white pills being passed back and forth in America's schools. And it's very hard to tell from 6 feet away which of them are innocent and which are not, and teachers anyway have better things to do with their time. The schools in this truly are not behaving very much differently from the whole of society. Grown-up Americans also confront ever-tightening rules and regulations meant to substitute for their fading self-restraint. As Americans shoot each other in greater numbers, governments must restrict their right, or feel they must restrict their right to bear arms. As old ideas of decorum collapse, courts codify what men and women may and may not say to each other in the office. As drug consumers put billions of dollars into the pockets of international criminals, the Treasury drafts new regulations that sharply reduce financial privacy. Indeed, Americans have less financial privacy than the people of just about any other advanced industrial democracy. For 35 years, the leaders of society have been teaching Americans that freedom is the right to do exactly as you please. To curse when you feel like cursing, to leer when you feel like leering, to blast your radio when you feel like blasting your radio. And that lesson has been thoroughly absorbed. The consequence? Well, I suppose you could call it freedom of a sort, but it's also true that Americans live with ever more rules and regulations in an ever more bureaucratic society. The sexual harassment law, I think, is one of the most spectacular examples that adults face. That whenever you read these cases, I find that I come away anyway with a sense of, it's indeed true that that man has done something that he should not have done, that was grossly inappropriate in an office environment. At the same time, I find it almost impossible to wrap my head around the concept that what he did could somehow be included under the rubric of anything that any of the authors of the 1964 Civil Rights Act intended to outlaw. But what is sexual harassment law but an attempt to cope with the shaking off of old restraints that men used to feel about what they did and said in the presence of women? Likewise, the sweeping powers of psychologists, which are growing at a fantastic rate, to condemn children to special education, a path that is very hard for a child ever to emerge from. What is that, if not a response to the disintegration of family structures and the hesitation, and a response to the hesitation of even intact families to inculcate in their children the habits of respect that promote successful adaptation to the school environment? I remember living in New York. When we lived in New York, we would sometimes visit a nearby lake and try to rent a little rowboat to take the dog and the kids for an airing. And we were stunned by the battery of rules that we encountered. No dog, the kids had to wear a life jacket, you had to have a form, you had to put down a $100 credit card deposit, you had to sign this unbelievable document discharging the boat owner from all risks of liability. It was quite an amazing thing I think the summer after we did this in New York for the first time, to visit my in-laws in the little town of Wellington, Ontario, where there is no litigation. Canadian law is very hostile to suing people. And to discover that there, the way you rent a boat was you put $20 on the counter, get the boat, take it out, return, and the man would give you 10 back. The state power expands as individual manners decay. This fact, this truth, would not have surprised Cicero. I don't see why it is such a surprise to us. Well, there are two responses to this, possible responses for conservatives to this historical truism. One is to accommodate a deteriorating moral standard and simply to accept that this is the way America is going to be from now on. Governor Weld of Massachusetts, for example, proposed in a bid for popularity to fly the flag of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts at half-mast for the death of Jerry Garcia. The flag of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. That's Cotton Mather's flag. The other response is to attempt to directly inculcate virtue somehow, an idea that has been floated by William Bennett very eloquently, which is a good idea if anybody had any idea of how to do this, but nobody does. The Greeks who thought hardest about it had to admit that even they were stumped. I think we need to think more about the virtues that we yearn to see revive, the virtues most important for a liberal democracy, for a commercial republic, which is what the United States is. These are the bourgeois virtues of fidelity, sobriety, thrift, patience, and responsibility. And what we need to remember about them is while these virtues did not come into being because they made sense, they did make sense. They did make sense. They were rational responses to a market-oriented society, simultaneously rich in opportunities and full of terrible dangers, against which there was scant protection but one's own resources and the help of family and friends. The opportunities in American life have, of course, remained, but the dangers have dwindled. And it is, I think, unsurprising that the virtues that were so useful for dealing with these dangers have dwindled alongside them. So now we ask, why be thrifty when your old age and health care are provided for, no matter how profitably you act in your youth? Why be prudent when the state insures your bank deposits, replaces your flooded-out house, buys all the wheat you can grow, and rescues you when you stray into a foreign battle zone? Why be faithful when there are no consequences at all to abandoning your family in search of newer and more exciting pleasures? Why be neat and uncomplaining when whining and squalor are indictments not of you, but of society? Yes, of course, it is true that the bonds of community can fray for all sorts of reasons. Social order rests upon the spontaneous collective observance of thousands of unwritten rules, rules about how to conduct oneself in public, how one should dress and speak, what is fair dealing and what is cheating. The social critics of the 1950s bemoaned the collective observance of these rules as conformity. But the conformity of those years turns out in retrospect to have been a passing phase. And it is one that as the habits of the war and the pain of depression have faded, we find ourselves less and less inclined to observe in response to less and less need for it. But what I would urge you to remember is that successful commercial societies have always been restrained societies. It is not true, as some critics of capitalism have said, that capitalism floats along on a sea of wild excess and delight and consumption for the sake of consumption. It is not true, as Tom Wolfe once mischievously said, that the true motto of capitalism is, if I have only one life to live, I'm going to live it as a blonde. Think of Calvinist Holland, think of Victorian Britain, think of 19th century America. It is not unchained markets and individual appetites that have upset community life. It is the destruction of the incentives and the necessity, that this not alone, but what has made it possible is the destruction of the incentives and necessity that untrammeled capitalism gave to those old virtues. Indeed, nothing, and I will conclude here, nothing has fomented feelings of entitlement quite as much as redistributionist public policy and the ethos of liberal egalitarianism. I've been doing a lot of work on the period of the late 1960s and early 1970s for the book I'm doing now. And it is startling. You can chart a near doubling between 1968 and 1976 of people's belief that they are entitled to a free college education provided by the state, that they're entitled to free medical care. Before 68, that was quite a minority point of view. Since 76, it's been a view held by more than half the population. In our heroic, but alas, inevitably futile determination to use the state to wipe away every human tear, we have taught ourselves a spooky certainty that failure everywhere and always reflects on society. That is a colossal project for the society, but it is also a very bad lesson for the people who live in that society. That is why, that is the truth of the relationship. That is the truth that the Republican Party needs to begin to understand if it is ever going to hold its disparate and potentially warring elements in harmony together. And I thank you for your attention.
Before we go to the, I'm sure, numerous questions that you will have as a result of that wonderful speech, I just wanted to thank, in my haste to introduce our speaker, I didn't get a chance to thank the Independent Women's Forum, not just for holding these seminars, but also for supporting the Women's Quarterly, that it's a very extravagant thing to own a magazine, and only people named Forbes tend to do it. But it is testimony to their belief in ideas, in expressing a large range of ideas, into certainly, allowing enormous editorial freedom. That we've heard a lot of talk about big tents this election season, and I think the IWF as a women's group is like a three-ring circus. I mean, I think there's many ways, but especially in its embrace of all of us who so enjoy working with them and being a part of it. So I think now we can go to questions.
Thank you, Danielle. I will say that we thank you equally, because every time we pick up a Women's Quarterly, we feel thrilled again to be independent women all together. David has agreed to take a few questions today, and we haven't given the book enough face time. This is his book, What's Right. A number of you have already ordered it, and we do want to leave a little time at the end for autographs. We have some extra copies in case some of you would like to take a copy along with you today. We do have the C-SPAN book channel here filming, so I would like to ask if you're posing a question, please stand so that the microphone holder can find you and that everybody both here and listening at home will be able to hear your question. And also, for the sake of moving things along, please do put your comments in the form of a question so that David can reply and we can move to the next. Thank you. Anybody?
Mr. Frum, do you think the parental rights legislation that's being proposed by some conservatives in Congress is an appropriate response? And if not, what would be an appropriate alternative?
I think it's very problematic. What I dread about parental rights legislation, it's the same thing that I dread about victims' rights legislation. It's, in a way, attempting to solve a problem with another dose of the stuff that got you into trouble in the first place, which is, in the case of the parental rights, for example, it's an attempt to restrain unrestrained and out-of-control school bureaucrats by inserting parents into the process in much the same way that teachers' unions and janitors' unions and the promoters of local economic activity now are. I think it's a stopgap. To my mind, that the way you assert parental authority over education is by localizing education, and that it's perhaps natural in an age where the Department of Education gives schools, the Federal Department of Education gives away money if schools obey it. State departments, local state departments of education write curricula that ought to be written closer to the home, where parents have very little choice of schools, where exit is difficult for anybody but the best off. It's difficult under those circumstances to get anybody to pay attention. I understand then the demand for parental bills of rights. Myself, I would prefer to work on making sure that that the schools have reason to listen to the parents. After all, successful companies don't have customer bills of rights. They listen to their customers because otherwise they go bankrupt. And it would be very, very nice if schools felt themselves subject to the same pressures. In the same way that yes, I suppose, given the way American law now is, it's good that the relatives of the victim or the victim of crime himself or herself should be able to stand up in court and say, let me tell you what this crime meant to me. I think it would be even better, though, if the police were able to introduce all the evidence they had about the crime to the jury, and if once a person was sentenced, that he actually had to serve the sentence that he was sentenced to, all of it. And that these are after-the-fact attempts to correct systems that aren't working very well. Thank you. Yes.
Thanks for your remarks. They were wonderful. Well, I have a very hopeful attitude towards human nature, but it seems to me that there's not so much hard science about sort of all the inputs that kids are getting and the effects. I mean, we know, like, finally in 1965, Luther Terry finally discovered that cigarettes were actually, surprise, surprise, bad for your lungs, and you can get, there's a causation to lung cancer. And it just seems to me, until we are able to get a little more of a handle and sort of some clarifying light on all these inputs, then I mean, you will have sort of like the gradual degradation of society, and the philosophical base isn't so consistent like as in 1930, where you had the Hayes Commission, and they, you know, labored over whether or not to put in Gone with the Wind, Franklin, my dear, I don't give a damn. I mean, there was more understanding back then. Why the lack of understanding, and what can we do to shed more light?
Well, I think a lot of the problem comes from the rise of large bureaucratic systems. I forget now. I'm going to steal somebody's line, and I forget now whose it is, so I can't pay credit. But it may have been Bill Bennett's. That when you are charged with the responsibility of educating one or two children, everybody knows what to do. There's nobody who, given the job of educating one or two kids, is going to make too many mistakes. You know, they need to learn to read, they need to learn to write, they need to learn to compute, do add and subtract, they need to learn to respect the law of the land, to rise when the flag passes by, the basics. It's only when you're responsible for educating 500,000 or more kids that the possibility arises of making some really foolish errors. Now, I think that I would not, though, put a lot of stock in looking to social science for confirming answers in the same way the physical sciences gave us hard answers about the dangers of smoking. I don't think social sciences work that way, and I think what you're in grave danger of doing, as, for example, has begun to happen now with, for example, the effects of single motherhood, that you can never say things exactly because you can't do controlled experiments with people because the subjects are animate, not inanimate. And they're thinking subjects. But it's also true that what you end up doing is spending 30 years wasting the lives of a generation or two to discover the essence of conservative wisdom, which is that your grandmother was right about these things. We already know the answers to these things. The question is, is how much pain do we have to endure before beginning again to act on the answers to these questions?
Political solution, because if we know the answers, we should act for them.
And we do. I think to a great extent in our own lives we do. It's only when we have too much responsibility for the lives of other people that we don't. And that I think the key is to begin to attack how much responsibility isolated people who are prone to fads have over the lives of other people. Yes, sir, in the back.
If I take it the gist of your remarks, at least one way to characterize them, is that the growth of government and government institutions to protect people from the bad consequences of their own actions has taken away the life lessons that have historically nurtured virtue. If that fairly summarizes, Daniel Yankelovich has written on this same subject, and he's talked about something that he calls the affluence effect. In it, he argues that that much more powerful a thing that's removed the negative consequences of personal bad behavior has been the success of our economy. Mm-hmm. That in fact it benefits and protects vastly more people from mistakes than these government programs do. Now, if that's right, it would suggest that short of a dramatic weakening of the economy and the opportunities that are available to people who drink on the job and get fired one day and can get another job the next when there's 4 or 5% unemployment and lots of opportunity. I mean, what is he right, and what's the fractional share of this diminution in the life lessons that's come about from the success of the economy in our society versus the presence of government?
I think he is right to a certain extent, and we just have to accept that as a fact. Affluence is a good thing. It's better to be an affluent society than a poor society, and a lot of the economic part of the conservative message is directed toward intelligent public policies that will cause that affluence to grow even faster. It's my suggestion, and I make this suggestion at great length in the first book, Dead Right, is that in a modern capitalist economy that risk can be made to do a lot of the functions that poverty once did. It's not that most people aren't poor, but most people in a truly free market economy would at all times be subject to the fear of poverty. Even though, and poverty is such a scary thing, and as we in a way get farther away from it, it becomes scarier and scarier, that the mere possibility of it can have some of the effects that the reality of it once had, and without a lot of the negative consequences of the reality, like bad dental hygiene and so on. That my view of the danger of the modern state, and the reason why I sort of go farther than a lot of the neoconservatives who say the problem is just welfare, and I'm worried about the effects of all the social insurance programs, is precisely because they tend to insulate people even from risk, and to tell people, look, if things go too wrong for you, there's always someone here to clean up. Well, that's humane, and that's good, I suppose, but it's also true that what it means is, for example, that it has an impact on the relations between the generations. That when parents know that their retirement is cared for, they don't have to worry so much about their kids, what their kids think of them. And when kids know that the government is the purchaser of education of last resort, they don't have to worry so much about what their parents think of them. That's putting family ties in maybe a bloodlessly utilitarian way. But one of the things that has happened in our modern world is, as we have removed a lot of the economic functionality of the family, that we have turned the family into something that exists only so long as all the people in it like each other. Well, that's nice. They should like each other, but it used to be true that this institution, worked even for the families where people, they weren't so crazy about each other, which is unfortunately always going to be a fairly substantial fraction of these families. But I think a modern economy can use, to a certain extent, risk the way an old-fashioned economy used non-affluence poverty. Amy.
Yes, you've been talking about governmental insurance programs to keep people from the consequences of their actions. And there's a new study by Ackroff, I can't remember the second researcher, that show with the double sort of punch of abortion and contraception, we've seen those as the insurance program for sexual behavior. And what tends to be the real lightning rod for these discussions about propriety and self-restraint ends up being a discussion about human sexuality. And I'd like to know what you have to say about that with these reproductive technologies. How do we reel it back in? How do we make people behave appropriately when they do have this sexual insurance program?
The question is not how do we make them. I mean, let me just be semantic for a moment, because that's where the liberty part of it. You don't want to make them. You want to lead them to help them realize that they themselves spontaneously want to do it differently. It's never going to be the same again. It's never going to be the same again. It's going to be always different from the way it was before 1960. That is a permanent fact. The question is, though, why does it have to be so different from the way it was in 1970? That when these technologies first came into being. I mean, abortion's been around for a long time, but easy and inexpensive and reliable contraception is fairly new. And they're intensifying social changes where you can at least say to people, you know what, you may do with your life whatever you want, but that child is primarily, if a child results, that's going to be almost entirely the responsibility of the people who brought it into being. I think here, for example, that one of the things that we're doing wrong now as we approach this is this attempt to have crackdowns on deadbeat parents, which is the politically correct term for deadbeat fathers, who are, of course, the people we're talking about. That one of the things that happens when you intensify that effort is, in a way, you intensify the problem. Is as you attempt to, I mean, think of this not from the point of view of the people you know and all the wonderful relationships they're in. But think of this from the point of view of someone with maybe less education, less money, a woman who's living in a world in which the men are not such baskets of fruit. They're not so wonderful. They're not so wonderful. Now, if there were a way where you could garnish a portion of their wages without having them around, that would be good. That would be better, because he's not you're not so crazy about having him around. And if you could figure out a way to have the state do the job of extracting money from him while you yourself are not obliged to live with him, that actually can have a very perverse effect. I think that that's an example of something where our first reaction is not maybe the best reaction to a modern problem. You were one of the first people to put up a hand.
Maybe you could explain to me why it is that as the sense of entitlement in this country has grown through the 70s and 80s, then there has also become a disconnect with government, or more people seem to want less government in their lives. Those things to me seem to be juxtaposed. Yeah. And I just wondered if
That's fascinating. It's a fascinating question. Maybe when we could. I'm writing a lot about it right now. I'm writing a book about it, and I don't want to exhaust your patience with it. Let me just throw out a couple of random and not too connected thoughts. If you believe, if you don't believe, if it's not occurred to you that it's the job of government to ensure that every capable student goes to university, if you don't think that, if that thought has not entered your head, then you're not going to be too unhappy when government fails to do it, as government inevitably will. But if you believe that that's something that government should do, that's something that government ought to do, the fact that it can't do it is going to cause you to, that's not changed. It's no more, government today is no more incompetent than the government of 1960 was. But what we look for it to do is, of course, grown so rapidly that it's bound to disappoint us. It's in a way like what happens with our parents when we leave childhood and enter adolescence, that we no longer expect them simply to have dinner on the table. We expect them to be fascinating conversationalists and people who can be good role models. And of course, they then we then disappoint our kids, and in a way that was not true when they looked to us for less. So that's one thing. A second thing is that as modern government has coped with these new expectations, it began to impose burdens on the economy that caused the growth rate of the economy to slow. The economy's been growing much slower since 1973 everywhere than it did before 73, and of course that coincides with the expansion of government everywhere, not just in the United States. That's not coincidental. I mean, there are people who will tell you that it's a coincidence. I don't think so. They'll think it's the oil shortage, even though the oil shortage, went away and oil is now cheaper than it ever was. And I think you think something happened, it continued to happen. What cause was there that continues to be there? It's the growth of the burdensomeness of government. So that economic disappointment has had an impact. And then the final thing that I would throw out to you is one of the ways that government attempted to cope with that new financial burden in the 70s, and that you're never sure that it won't try again, is through inflation, which is a way that overstretched governments tend to meet their obligations. And inflation everywhere and always has a profound effect on people's trust. It changes your relationship to the future. It changes your relationship to other people. It changes the relationship between production and consumption. And it also changes the relationship between elites and non-elites, because elites quickly figure out how inflation works and how to cope with it. But inflation is extremely complicated and tricky, and as the inflation rate bobs up and down, the people are always being left behind. They buy houses when they shouldn't, they don't when they should, and that I think that presence of inflation has had a major impact on the standard of living of less well-educated Americans, and has had some important causation of their growing cynicism about the authorities. I don't know if that's...
Let me just throw it the other way for a political argument, and then I'll quit. Why is it that we couldn't use that same, just what you've described in reverse, and say, look, government has tried to do X, Y, and Z, and it hasn't done it. Therefore, let's take this out of the entitlement category when we're looking at budget issues.
Yeah. Well, we tried that, and one of the things that makes all of this so painful and complicated is it's not so easy to persuade people not to expect things anymore. It's very easy to persuade them to expect it in the first place.
If they're malcontent on getting the services that's supposed to stem from that entitlement, then why shouldn't it be easier to make the argument that if that money goes back to you directly, you can do it? On your own?
Because they'd rather not have the money. They'd rather have the thing. I mean, when you say, actually, look, what I'm doing right now is I'm taking from you $1 a year in taxes, and I'm promising you $15 a year in Social Security payments down the line. And then he said, I realize that promise is unsupportable. I'll tell you what, you take back the $1 in taxes and forget about the $15 in social. That was a great deal. I lost that deal. I'm mad about that. And the fact that the $1 is now back in your pocket isn't a consolation. You were expecting a good deal and you didn't get it. And as any assistant manager at a Walmart can tell you, when the good deal, that people expected to see at the store isn't there when they get there, a riot can break out. So it's not so easy. I mean, I think that that it's happened more in other places. I'm a Canadian, I've lived for a long time in Canada. It's happened there much more than here because the state has hit a fiscal crisis that was much more extreme. But I think Canadians have had to grapple much more than Americans have done with the fact that the entitlement, the promises their state has made, if delivered, will bring the country to fiscal collapse, absolute fiscal collapse. And when people confront that, they step back a little bit. And you've seen a very big change in public attitudes. Not that Canadians are yet as conservative as Americans, but with the movement in their attitudes is much greater than anything I think that has happened here. But the fact is the United States has coped with its entitlement state better than other advanced industrial democracies, with the result that people don't see why they should change their ways as clearly as people in other countries do. Who had were you watching? Go ahead.
Okay. Back in the late 50s, early 60s, when I was growing up, the pressures and the way that you gained virtue in your life were family, faith, peers. Okay, with the rise of the electronic media in this day and age, partly due, I think, probably you're right, to government programs, it's now become peers and the electronic media that really are what shapes more of people's mores. There seems to be less interaction within families and within community. Do you see a relationship between the electronic media and the growth of big government and the devolution of values in our lives and the falling apart of the culture that way? And do you see a way of getting around that as an obstacle in restoring virtue?
Well, that's an interesting question. This allows me to insert another commercial for my forthcoming book about the 70s. One of the things that is really remarkable when you look at the statistics on public trust between 68 and 74. Now, as everybody knows, in those years, faith in government collapses. But it is not just government. Faith in all kinds of institutions collapse. Even in medicine, the most trusted institution in American life. It doesn't collapse, but it tails off quite noticeably and then it then levels out at a much lower level than it was before 68. There's one exception, which is TV. People between 68 and 74 continue to trust TV. In fact, their trust in TV rises. Now, why is that? Well, that's a fascinating thing. Why should that? Their trust in the print media, by the way, falls, but the trust in TV rises. Well, I turn on 60 Minutes, which, when it's not glamorizing the Independent Women's Forum, is, I think, an example of a lot of what is worst about the electronic media, that in a way that what people on television do, especially in nonfiction TV, if we can call it that, is they position themselves as sort of tribunes of the people. And they enhance their own credibility precisely by calling into question the loyalty and honesty and decency of others. That's the patented 60 Minutes method, right? You bust into the office of the head of the pharmaceutical company with your minicam, and you say, "J'accuse," you know? And the effect of that is people watching this see the head of that CEO is a bum, and the man with the minicam, by contrast, must be, you know, Cato the Elder. So I think that there is that TV for reasons reasons that implicit maybe even in the technology of it tends to enhance its own authority by subverting the authority of other institutions. So that's one thing that goes on. You know, it's also true, you know, that one of the that the plot of almost every modern situation comedy is the same as the plots of the plays written by Plautus and Terence 2,000 years ago. You know, the point of comedy is always that people in positions of authority are exposed to be pompous blowhards and fools, and that it's always in those days it was the slave, nowadays it's the teenagers who, you know, show people what's what. And it's this reversal of the normal pattern of life that makes comedy funny. Well, it's one thing when people are, you know, 3 times a year going to the local festival and seeing a comedy, and then most of the rest of the time that the society is sending them a message that, you know, actually, you know, the people in authority, you know, we have to work on the assumption that they're not pompous blowhards and fools. It's different if you were able to watch 3 of those a night or 4 of them a night. That there is a kind that some of these things are very eternal messages, but the mere frequency of repetition that TV makes available does have an impact. Now, what do we do about all of this? You know, I think this is one of those areas where the social conservatives are wrong. I'm not sure that there's a collective response that is very easy to imagine to this problem. It's very easy to imagine what the individual response is, which is after the show is over, turn the damn thing off. But collectively, I don't know. It's hard for me to imagine within the context of a liberal democracy that there is very much you can do. Yes, ma'am, in the back.
I want to bring it down to the election for a second. I keep hearing all about these polls that people are taking where people are claiming that they believe that Clinton is an untrustworthy person and he doesn't have a good character, and yet they're going to vote for him anyway. And I want you to comment on what you think that is all about. I mean, it can't just be the failure of the Dole campaign, as bad as it's been, or maybe it is, but I got to believe there's something else going on there.
Yeah. I would not hold myself out as any kind of expert on voter behavior. Let me throw a couple of hypotheses. One is that I think that people often respond to poll questions not with what they think, but with what they imagine a sophisticated person would think. Because, in fact, the question is one that they've never really focused on before. You know, is the president trustworthy or not? I don't know. I know that the people who are on TV talking about this talk as if he weren't, and therefore that must be the intelligent point of view, and then they'll repeat it. I wonder whether he's really distrusted quite as much as the poll numbers make it seem. Most people, after all, I mean, the reasons that one would have to distrust him are fairly complicated, and they require you to be fairly familiar with the intricacies of, you know, very complicated allegations about the FBI and the White House Travel Office and his record on promises like welfare and so on. So that would be one thought. The second thought is it does tell you something not about the Dole campaign, but about the candidate himself, that there's an old political saw that if people are asked to choose between false hope and no hope, they will choose false hope every time. And, you know, at some level, that the question we're asking people, we are going to, after the election, the media, my profession, is going to turn this enormous battery of analysis on the election result. But in fact, we were asking people a very simple binary question: Joe, Fred. And they're going to look at that, and ultimately, that's the universe of choice. If they may have 14 reasons for disliking Fred, but if they've got 19 reasons for disliking Joe, Fred will win. And I think that the blame here belongs not so much to the public. There are plenty of things you can blame the public for. The fact that they don't vote, they're not as educated as they should be, that is indeed the fault of the citizens. They should educate themselves. It's not the job of the people in authority to make sure that politics is entertaining and easy to understand. It's people's responsibility to inform themselves. But it is the political system that casts up this choice of pair of candidates. And if the Republican Party has failed to offer a compelling alternative to the president, I don't think that it's right to say, therefore the people should be scolded for not taking Clinton's character flaws more seriously. The fault belongs to the Republican Party for not offering them a better alternative.
And on that note, Dave.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for coming. Any of you who want to pick up David's book and have him sign it, I'm sure he'd be glad to stick around for a few minutes to do so. Thank you.